Was the temporizing also to have other countries take it on the chin and absorb more of the catastrophes of war? The United States came out of that war, considering it was a world war, relatively unscathed, and in fact stronger than when it went in. The only country to come out stronger than when it went in.
You're absolutely right. In fact, in a very fundamental way, the United States was the only country that won World War II. Everybody else lost. There were degrees of loss. Germany was devastated, Japan was devastated, but the Soviet Union, of course, one of America's principal allies, was, you could say, hollowed out. It looked as though it won, but the Soviet economy was wrecked. The Soviet agricultural system was devastated, and it took the Soviets years to recover. So the Soviet government, Stalin, certainly thought that the British and the Americans were conspiring against the Soviet Union. It was very clear from 1941 to 1944 that the only really serious fighting being done against the Nazis was being done by the Soviet Red Army. And Stalin rarely said it quite so bluntly to Roosevelt's face, but it became clear that the Soviets were thinking that you guys are just delaying so that we will carry the weight of the war, so that we will kill as many Germans as possible, so that when you guys get into the war, you'll just get in on the mopping up operations. And Roosevelt had to take great pains to reassure Stalin that this wasn't his principal motive. Now, it probably was part of Churchill's motive. Roosevelt wasn't a cynical guy. Roosevelt was a realist, but he wasn't cynical. Churchill could be as cynical as anybody, and Churchill knew perfectly well that his job was to secure the future, to the extent he could, of the British Empire. He wasn't fighting for democracy. He wasn't fighting for the United Nations. He was fighting for the British Empire. And in that respect, Churchill and Stalin were more birds of a feather, because they each had a very clear understanding of what the interests of their country required. Roosevelt understood what American interests were, but he cast American interests more broadly. Roosevelt had been a supporter of the League of Nations in the First World War, and he thought it was a mistake for the United States not to join the League of Nations, and he thought that World War II was the natural consequence of the failure of the League of Nations. And from even before the United States entered the Second World War, Roosevelt believed that the only satisfactory outcome would be a new League of Nations, became called the United Nations, and American leadership in that organization. So Roosevelt had American interests quite clearly at the center of his thinking regarding policy. But it was a broad interpretation of American interests to include an active and important United Nations and American participation in that. To the heart of your question, did Roosevelt deliberately delay American entry? No, he didn't. But he allowed himself to be constrained by Churchill, who did deliberately delay.
What is Roosevelt's chief contribution to the shape of post-war America and world politics? You mentioned the United Nations. How did Roosevelt's design affect our Cold War?
The principal contribution that Roosevelt made to world affairs was persuading the American people that the United States needed to play an important and continuing role in ensuring international security, international stability. Roosevelt came to office at a moment of American isolationism, and it took him from 1933 until 1941 to change the minds of the American people, to make Americans realize that what happened in the broader world did have an impact on their lives. And so Roosevelt's principal contribution was this continuing American participation in world affairs. For a while it looked as though this would be channeled primarily through the United Nations. It didn't work out that way because of the Cold War. But the fact that the United States from 1945 until now, 2009, has been the primary player in world affairs is Roosevelt's most important legacy.
So we still live very much in Roosevelt's world.
No question about it. Roosevelt, if you look at what Roosevelt did between 1933 and 1945, he dramatically changed Americans' expectations of government at home and Americans' expectations of their country in the world at large. And in both of those areas, in terms of what Americans expect of government at home and what Americans expect of their country in the world, we really haven't seriously revised what Roosevelt accomplished. We still very much live in the world of Franklin Roosevelt.
H.W. Brands, thank you very much, as always.
My pleasure, Gleaves.